Wyoming is the least crowded state in the entire country, and that empty space is hiding some of the strangest geography on the planet. This is a place where a single mountain stream splits and feeds two different oceans, where sand dunes hum like they're alive, and where a slab of solid rock once slid across the ground faster than most cars drive on the highway. It's also a state where antelope genuinely outnumber people, where the tallest mountain barely gets mentioned by anyone outside the state, and where scientists recently dug up North America's oldest known dinosaur. Wyoming rarely gets the spotlight compared to flashier states, but once you actually start digging into its geography, it becomes obvious this place has been quietly hoarding some of the strangest natural records in the entire country, tucked away behind mountains most Americans couldn't name and towns most Americans couldn't find on a map. By the time we get through all 25 of these, you're going to understand why Wyoming might be the most underrated state in America. Let's get into it. Fact 25. The river that flows into two oceans. Let's start with the one that sounds the most made up. In a remote patch of the Teton Wilderness, there's a spot called Two Ocean Pass, and this is where a single mountain stream does something it really shouldn't be able to do. The creek hits a flat piece of land and simply splits into two separate streams. One half turns west and eventually reaches the Pacific Ocean. The other half turns east and eventually reaches the Atlantic Ocean. So a single drop of water falling in that one exact spot could end up on opposite sides of the entire continent, thousands of miles apart, without ever meeting again. It's one of the only places like it anywhere on Earth, and it happens quietly, deep in the backcountry, far from any road, with almost nobody around to witness it. Hikers who make the trek out to see it in person often describe standing at the split as one of the strangest moments of their entire lives, watching a single body of water make a permanent decision to go in two completely different directions. Early explorers and surveyors were reportedly just as baffled by the sight, since nothing about the surrounding terrain gives any obvious hint beforehand that the creek is about to divide itself in two. Fact 24. The mountain that slid 100 miles per hour. If you thought that was strange, wait until you hear what happened at Heart Mountain. About 50 million years ago, a slab of solid rock bigger than the entire state of Rhode Island broke loose and slid across the Wyoming landscape at speeds over 100 miles per hour. Rock simply isn't supposed to move that fast. For decades, geologists couldn't explain how something that heavy could travel that quickly without grinding to a stop almost instantly under its own weight. The leading theory scientists have today is that the slab actually rode on a cushion of superheated gas, basically floating across the surface like a giant hockey puck made of solid stone. It remains one of the most puzzling and dramatic landslides ever discovered anywhere in the world, and researchers still travel to the site today to study exposed layers of rock that recorded the exact moment this ancient mountain went sliding across the landscape. Some geologists have spent entire careers trying to fully explain the mechanics behind it, and even now, decades of research later, parts of the process still aren't completely settled science. Fact 23. A supervolcano sitting beneath Yellowstone. That's just the warm-up, because underneath Yellowstone sits something even bigger. The entire park, which happens to be the very first national park established anywhere on the planet, is built directly on top of a supervolcano roughly 45 miles long and 30 miles wide. That supervolcano last erupted about 640,000 years ago, and it's technically still active today, which is exactly why the ground there stays covered in bubbling hot springs, boiling mud pots, and hissing steam vents scattered across the park. Living directly above an active supervolcano sounds like something out of a disaster movie. Yet millions of visitors walk across that same ground every single year without giving it a second thought, snapping photos of the very features created by the heat simmering just beneath their feet. Scientists closely monitor the ground here for even the smallest shifts, since the same magma chamber responsible for today's hot springs is technically capable of producing another eruption someday, even though nothing suggests that's likely to happen anytime in the near or even distant future. Fact 22. A geyser you can set your watch by inside that same supervolcano sits Old Faithful, one of the most famous geysers on Earth, and it earned its name honestly. This geyser blows steaming water dozens of feet into the air, roughly 17 times a day, on a schedule reliable enough that rangers can predict the next eruption within a fairly tight window ahead of time. It's been doing that consistently for longer than anyone alive today has been watching. A rhythmic reminder that there's a massive reservoir of heat and pressure sitting just beneath the surface of the park at all times. Crowds still gather around the same viewing area, day after day, decade after decade, waiting for a geological feature that has never once needed a schedule change. The name itself dates back to some of the earliest expeditions into the region, when explorers were so struck by its consistency that comparing it to anything less reliable simply didn't feel accurate. Fact 21. A hot spring bigger than a football field. Not far from Old Faithful sits the Grand Prismatic Spring, the largest hot spring in the entire United States, and one of the largest in the world. This single spring stretches wider than a full-sized football field and glows in rings of deep blue, green, orange, and red, thanks to different types of heat-loving bacteria thriving at different temperatures around its edges. From ground level, it's already stunning, but from above, the rainbow-colored rings become even more dramatic, looking almost like something painted onto the landscape rather than something that grew there naturally over thousands of years of mineral deposits and microbial growth. The colors themselves actually shift with the seasons, since the specific bacteria thriving at the spring's edges change their pigment depending on how much sunlight and heat they're exposed to throughout the year. Fact 20. Water that never reaches an ocean. Here's where things get even weirder. Not too far from Yellowstone sits the Great Divide Basin, a place where the normal rules of geography completely break down. Usually, the continental divide is a single line that decides whether rainwater eventually flows toward the Pacific or the Atlantic. But right here, that line actually splits into two separate paths and wraps around a giant basin in the middle of the state. Any water that lands inside that basin never reaches either ocean. It just sits there, evaporating in the dry air or forming shallow ghost lakes that eventually disappear completely, without ever draining anywhere else. Geologists have nicknamed it the place water checks into but never checks out of, and once you understand what's happening geologically underneath that basin, that nickname starts to make perfect sense. Wild horses and pronghorns still roam across this same stretch of high desert today, adapted to surviving in a landscape where surface water can be unpredictable and scarce for long stretches of the year. Early wagon train travelers crossing this same basin in the 1800s reportedly grew confused by it too, since watching a river or stream simply vanish into the ground defies almost everything people typically expect from moving water. Fact 19. Sand dunes that actually sing. While we're on strange land, Wyoming also has sand that makes noise. The Kilpecker Dunes stretch across more than 100,000 acres of high desert, and when the wind moves across them just right, the sand actually produces a low, eerie humming sound that carries across the open landscape for a surprising distance. Nobody stumbling across it for the first time expects the ground itself to start singing. But that's exactly what happens here, as countless grains of sand rub and shift against each other in just the right pattern to create sound, a phenomenon found in only a small handful of places on the entire planet. The specific size, shape, and dryness of the sand grains all have to line up perfectly for the humming effect to occur, which is exactly why singing dunes remain such a rare and unusual find anywhere in the world, let alone in the middle of Wyoming. Fact 18. A tower that looks man-made, but isn't speaking. Of things that shouldn't exist but do, there's Devil's Tower, rising 867 feet straight up out of flat plains in the northeast corner of the state. It became the very first national monument in the entire country, back in 1906, and it's built out of tightly packed vertical columns of rock that almost look like they were carved by hand with tools. They weren't. That's simply how the rock cooled and cracked millions of years ago as it hardened underground, forming those distinct columns, before the softer surrounding rock slowly eroded away over time, leaving the tower standing alone against the sky, like a monument nobody actually built. Its dramatic silhouette has made it one of the most recognizable natural landmarks in the entire country, instantly identifiable even to people who've never set foot anywhere near Wyoming. Fact 17. The tallest point nobody's heard of, up in the Wind River Range, sits another one most people have never even heard of. Gannett Peak is the actual highest point in Wyoming, at 13,809 feet, taller than the far more famous Grand Teton just down the road. But because it's tucked deep inside a wilderness area, with no roads leading anywhere near it, almost nobody has ever heard its name, even though it wins the height contest by a wide margin over its far more photogenic neighbor. Reaching the summit requires a serious multi-day backcountry trip through remote terrain, which is a big part of why it stays so far off the average traveler's radar compared to peaks you can simply drive up to. Even many longtime Wyoming residents have never actually laid eyes on it in person, since it sits so deep inside protected wilderness that only a small number of experienced mountaineers ever attempt the journey each year. Meanwhile, Grand Teton continues to appear on postcards and posters across the state, simply because it's visible from the highway, while Gannett Peak stays hidden behind ridgelines that most travelers never even glance toward. Fact 16. Antelope outnumber people. And speaking of things you'd never expect to outnumber people, pronghorn antelope actually do exactly that in Wyoming. These animals roam the open plains here in higher numbers than anywhere else in the entire country. And with a human population under 600,000, the antelope genuinely outnumber the residents by a meaningful margin. So statistically, if you're standing somewhere out in rural Wyoming, you're more likely to spot an antelope grazing nearby than another human being walking past. Herds move freely across huge stretches of open range here, following seasonal migration routes that in some cases stretch well over 100 miles from summer grazing grounds down to winter shelter, a journey that ranks among the longest land migrations left anywhere in the continental United States. Fact 15. The least populated state, with full Senate power. Now let's talk about how empty this place really is, because the numbers are almost hard to believe. Wyoming is the 10th largest state in the country by land, but it has fewer people living in it than any other state in America, with a population under 600,000. To put that in perspective, some single neighborhoods in New York City have more people crammed inside them than the entire state of Wyoming holds across its entire landmass. And here's the part that really throws people off. Even with that tiny population, Wyoming still gets 2 full senators in Washington, exactly the same number as California, a state with tens of millions of residents. That means a single vote cast in Wyoming carries dramatically more mathematical weight in the Senate than a single vote cast almost anywhere else in the entire country. Fact 14. Only 2 escalators in the whole state. That emptiness gets even stranger once you learn this next one. In the entire state of Wyoming, there are only 2 escalators, and both of them happen to be sitting in the same city, Casper. That means if you're somehow afraid of escalators, Wyoming might genuinely be the safest state in the entire country for you to live in, since you'd essentially have to go out of your way to ever encounter one in your daily life. Most Wyoming towns simply never grew large enough to need multi-story shopping centers or airports of the size that usually justify installing one in the first place. Visitors from bigger cities sometimes treat the pair of escalators in Casper like a minor tourist attraction simply because they're such a rare sight anywhere else in the state. Fact 13. An underground energy powerhouse. But don't let the empty land fool you, because underground, Wyoming is an absolute powerhouse. It produces more coal than any other state, supplying close to 40% of the entire nation's coal, and 2 of the largest coal mines on the planet, Black Thunder and North Antelope Rochelle, sit right here in the Powder River Basin. On top of that, Wyoming also holds the largest known uranium reserves in the entire country, sitting quietly underground, while most of the world pictures Wyoming as nothing but open range and grazing cattle. All that quiet, empty land above ground is sitting on top of some of the most valuable energy resources in America. Trains loaded with coal roll out of the Powder River Basin around the clock, feeding power plants scattered across dozens of states that most people would never guess are connected all the way back to Wyoming's open range. It's a strange contrast that plays out across the entire state, where quiet, rolling grassland sits directly above some of the busiest industrial mining operations found anywhere in North America. Fact 12. The first place women could vote. Here's one that has nothing to do with rocks or minerals, and everything to do with history. Back in 1869, Wyoming became the very first place in the entire United States, before it was even a state yet, to grant women the right to vote. That single decision, made decades before the rest of the country followed suit, is exactly why Wyoming still carries the nickname the Equality State today, more than 150 years later, a title stamped directly onto the state's license plates as a permanent reminder. The decision was partly strategic at the time, meant to help attract more settlers to a sparsely populated territory, but it still stands today as a genuine milestone in the broader history of voting rights across the entire country. Fact 11. Rock older than the dinosaurs, and a dinosaur older than almost anything. If rocks could talk, the ones in Wyoming would have the oldest stories to tell. Underneath the Bighorn Mountains, the basement rock dates back roughly 3.25 billion years, making it some of the oldest exposed rock found anywhere on the entire continent. Rock that was already ancient, long before dinosaurs ever existed anywhere on the planet. Speaking of dinosaurs, in 2025, researchers announced they had discovered North America's oldest known dinosaur, right here in Wyoming, a small feathered creature dating back 230 million years. And they gave it a name, pulled directly from the Shoshone language, in honor of the region where it was found. The discovery pushed back the known timeline of dinosaurs on this continent even further than scientists had previously confirmed, adding Wyoming to an already impressive list of major paleontological breakthroughs made within its borders over the past century and a half of active digging. Fact 10. A mysterious stone wheel in the mountains. There's also a structure up near the town of Lovell that still puzzles historians today. High in the mountains sits a massive circle of stones with lines running out from the center like spokes on a wheel, and evidence suggests people were using this land for at least 12,000 years before anyone ever wrote any of it down. Nobody knows exactly why it was built the way it was, only that it clearly meant something important to the people who spent the effort constructing it at that altitude, hauling stones into place at an elevation most modern hikers find challenging just to visit. Some tribal traditions connect the site to seasonal ceremonies and astronomical alignments, and the location remains an active, respected place of spiritual significance for several indigenous communities today, not simply a historical curiosity left over from the past. Fact 9. Nearly half the state isn't even owned by the state. On top of everything else, almost half of Wyoming isn't even controlled by the state itself. Close to 48% of the land here belongs to the federal government, covering national forests, parks, and vast stretches of open range that regular people can freely hike, camp, and explore without needing special permission. That's nearly 1 out of every 2 acres in the entire state sitting under federal ownership, which is a big part of why so much of Wyoming still looks completely untouched by modern development, decades after most of the rest of the country has been paved over. That heavy federal presence has shaped nearly every part of daily life in rural Wyoming, from ranching leases to hunting seasons to the sheer amount of public land available for anyone willing to make the drive out to it. Fact 8. A 181-degree temperature swing. The weather here doesn't do things halfway either. The hottest temperature ever recorded in Wyoming hit 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the town of Basin back in 1983. The coldest ever recorded dropped all the way down to negative 66 degrees Fahrenheit near Yellowstone in 1933. That's a swing of 181 degrees between the hottest and coldest days this state has ever lived through, all inside the same set of borders. Proof that Wyoming's climate refuses to sit still at either extreme for very long. Residents who live through both seasons often say it's less about picking the right jacket and more about being ready for genuinely anything the sky decides to throw at them, sometimes within the very same week, or even the very same day depending on where you happen to be standing. Fact 7. One of only 3 perfectly rectangular states, Wyoming is also one of only 3 states in the entire country shaped like a near-perfect rectangle, joining Utah and Colorado in that exclusive little club. Unlike most states, whose borders were carved out along rivers, coastlines, or mountain ridges, Wyoming's edges were drawn almost entirely using straight lines of latitude and longitude by surveyors working with little regard for the actual terrain underneath. That clean, boxy shape makes Wyoming instantly recognizable on any map of the country, even to people who've never actually visited or spent any real time studying its borders. Ironically, the mountains, rivers, and basins carved into the actual landscape inside those straight borders couldn't be less orderly, creating a strange contrast between the tidy rectangle on the map and the rugged, unpredictable terrain hiding within it. Fact 6. A state that's doubly landlocked, Wyoming, carries a strange geographic label that most people have never even heard of. It's considered one of the doubly landlocked states in the country, meaning it doesn't just lack a coastline of its own, it's also completely surrounded by other landlocked states that have no coastline either. That double layer of separation from the ocean puts Wyoming in a very small club of American states that are about as far removed from saltwater as it's geographically possible to be, while still remaining inside the continental United States. It's the kind of geographic trivia that sounds almost too specific to be real, yet it perfectly captures just how deep into the interior of the country Wyoming actually sits, hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline in every single direction you could possibly drive. Fact 5. Over 4,200 lakes hiding in the desert. Even though Wyoming often gets pictured as dry, dusty, and desert-like, the state is actually home to more than 4,200 lakes and reservoirs scattered across its mountains and basins. That's a surprising amount of water hiding inside a state most people assume is defined entirely by sagebrush and open range, tucked away in high alpine basins and glacial valleys that most visitors never think to look for unless they venture well off the main highways. Many of these lakes formed thousands of years ago, when ancient glaciers carved deep basins into the mountains before slowly melting away and leaving behind the clear, cold water that fills them today. Fishermen who make the effort to reach some of the more remote ones often describe having entire lakes completely to themselves for days at a time, a level of solitude that's become almost impossible to find anywhere else in the country. Fact 4. A name that simply means on the Great Plain. Even Wyoming's own name has a surprisingly literal origin. The word comes from a Delaware and Munsee phrase that roughly translates to on the Great Plain, a name originally used to describe a valley thousands of miles away in Pennsylvania before it was later borrowed for this state entirely by coincidence. Once you actually see the wide, flat stretches of land covering much of eastern Wyoming, that borrowed name ends up fitting the state almost perfectly, even though it wasn't originally created with Wyoming in mind at all. The name was proposed by lawmakers who simply liked how it sounded, borrowing it secondhand from a completely different region rather than drawing on anything unique to the territory itself. Fact 3. The only authentic Archaeopteryx fossil outside Europe. Down in the town of Thermopolis, the Wyoming Dinosaur Center holds something found nowhere else on this side of the planet. It's home to the only genuine Archaeopteryx fossil ever discovered outside of Europe, a creature roughly 150 million years old that helped scientists connect the evolutionary dots between dinosaurs and modern birds. Every other confirmed specimen of this famous transitional fossil has come from a single region in Germany, which makes this one, Wyoming discovery, an extraordinary exception to that pattern, and a genuine point of scientific pride for a state better known for cattle and coal. Visitors from around the world make the trip specifically to see it, standing in front of a fossil that connects a small town in rural Wyoming directly to one of the most important discoveries in the entire history of evolutionary science. Fact 2. An ancient lake, preserved in Solid Rock Fossil Butte National Monument, protects the remains of an ancient lake that existed here millions of years ago, and the layers of rock underneath it are packed with an almost unbelievable number of preserved fish, crocodiles, and even fossilized birds. The conditions at the bottom of that ancient lake were so calm and undisturbed that entire skeletons were preserved in incredible detail rather than being scattered or crushed, giving scientists one of the clearest windows anywhere in the world into what life actually looked like tens of millions of years ago, layer by layer, almost like a photograph frozen directly into stone. Paleontologists have pulled tens of thousands of individual fossils from this single site over the years, and new specimens continue to surface from the same layers of rock to this day. Fact 1. A mountain range older than almost anything on the continent. Finally, tucked inside the Bighorn Basin sits a massive valley, roughly 100 miles wide, completely boxed in on all sides by 4 separate mountain ranges rising up around its edges. That basin holds some of the most complete geological layers found anywhere in North America, allowing scientists to read hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history simply by studying the exposed rock walls along its edges, layer by layer, like flipping through the pages of an ancient book written directly into stone rather than paper. Researchers have spent entire careers studying this single basin, since so much of the continent's deep geological history happens to be stacked up neatly right here, exposed and readable in a way that's rare almost anywhere else, drawing paleontologists and geologists back to the same stretch of Wyoming, decade after decade. So the next time somebody tells you nothing exciting ever happens in Wyoming, you'll know better. This is a state with splitting rivers, singing sand, sliding mountains, ghost lakes, and rock older than almost anywhere else on Earth, all hiding behind some of the emptiest land in the entire country. If one of these facts genuinely surprised you, let me know which one in the comments, and subscribe if you want more hidden state secrets from across the rest of the country.